If you thought the previous era was complex, wait until you see this one. We'll add 4 new branches in this era: the Jack branch, Devil Summoner branch, Persona branch, and the Devil Children branch. Just so that we can get it out of the way, I won't begin with the first game in this era, but rather the first game to get localised in the West in this era, which was Jack Bros. It's one of the more child-friendly games in the series, and tells of the 3 Jack brothers, Frost, Lantern and Ripper, changed to Skeleton in the US release, trying to get home from the real world on Halloween. It plays in a top-down action style, similar to the original Telenet game in fact, and is considered one of the better titles for the ill-fated console. Next we return to the main branch for the first actual game in this era, the 1994 SNES game Shin Megami Tensei If, which is a pivotal title in the series. It falls under the Shin Megami Tensei branch, but it also acts as a prototype for Persona, a Persona Zero. The title comes from the 60s British film If, though other than both being set in high schools and featuring out-of-place combat, there's very little to link the two. The player is free to choose the gender of the protagonist of the game, though through the later Persona games, the female protagonist has been confirmed as the canon one. There's 4 different endings, but rather than being based on your alignment, like in usual Megami Tensei games, the endings are based on who is in your party, as your companion throughout the game determines what dungeons you face as well as your ending. Continuing on, we have yet another game that comes into 2 branches, Shin Megami Tensei Devil Summoner, for the Sega Saturn, released in 1995. It's in the main Shin Megami Tensei branch, and in the Devil Summoner branch, as the name would suggest. Yet another game to not receive a Western release, though this one hasn't even received an English fan patch. Like If, this game changed the setting from the usual post-apocalyptic setting to contemporary Japan. Also, as with If, at its time of release, there appeared to be no direct links to other MegaTen games, though later on both of these games ended up linked together and to the main games. Games in this branch have a detective theme, with the first entry featuring the protagonist being killed and possessing the body of Kyoji Kuzunoha. Later on the player is joined by the original Kyoji, who is possessing someone else's body. This game received a direct sequel in 1997, also for the Sega Saturn, called Devil Summoner Soul Hackers. Kyoji features in this as a minor ally in the hackers' battle against the Phantom Society. This sequel received a major update with a PlayStation version in 1999, including a new dungeon, and the first game received a PSP remake in 2005. The Persona series got its first proper title with Megami Ibunroku Persona, known as Revelations Persona in the West, in 1996 for the PlayStation. It's known for being severely edited in its Western release, changing names and character designs to fit a Western setting, as well as the removal of the game's second Snow Queen quest. The If protagonist appears in this game under the name Tamaki, cementing that the 2 games take place in the same timeline, as well as sharing thematic elements. There are 4 endings, a good end and a bad end for each of the 2 routes. This game uses a third-person perspective outside of dungeons, and a first-person perspective in dungeons, with random battles and a grid-based battle system. Also, party members were permanent once they joined the party, making many of them mutually exclusive. This game introduced Igor and the Velvet Room, as well as Philemon, the big good of the series if you will, and Nyarlathotep, the big bad of the series. Switching back to the Shin Megami Tensei branch, in 1997, a game called Giten Megami Tensei Tokyo Mokushiroku was released for PC. Giten meaning false, rather than the usual Shin meaning true. It appears to take place in an alternate future to SMT2, sometime after the apocalyptic events of the first SMT game. This has very little to do with the Tokyo Mokushiroku manga series from the previous era, other than its story writer serving as director in this game, and the school from the manga cameoing in Giten Megami Tensei. Next up, we go back over to the Majin Tensei branch for the 3rd game in the series, simply entitled Ronde, released in 1997 for the Sega Saturn. The only thing that connects it to the Majin Tensei branch is the gameplay style. The game was developed by a different team, while Atlus worked on Soul Hackers, and to be honest it shows. This game is widely considered to be one of the worst in the franchise, but it does still have a cult following among some. Unlike Ronde, it's impossible to place Mucken X into any branch of Megami Tensei. It doesn't really belong as a Megami Tensei game, however it had largely the same team as the MegaTen games, with art by Kazuma Kaneko, music by Shoji Meguro, and the directorial debut of Katsura Hashino, who later went on to direct SMT3, as well as Persona 3 through to 5. You played as a sword with the power to possess people, amid a version of America and China on the verge of war. Many aspects of it were fairly original for the time, such as being a first-person sword-fighting action game, and gameplay rather than choices affecting which of the 7 endings you got. The original was released on Dreamcast in 1996, with a PlayStation overhaul in 2001, which turned it into a third-person game due to many Japanese gamers complaining of motion sickness from the original first-person game. Developed at the same time as Mucken was the sequel to the original Persona, Persona 2 Innocent Sin. It featured cameos from most party members of the original game, as well as one returning as a party member. This featured a new group of Persona users dealing with a phenomenon where rumours became real. More links to previous games come in the form of Tamaki from If, working for the Kuzunoha Detective Agency, led by the same Koji Kuzunoha from Devil Summoner, albeit possessing a different body. The climax of the game features a revived Hitler, actually an avatar of Nyarlathotep from the original game, killing party member Maya, and destroying most of the world. To revive Maya and the rest of the world, Philemon creates a parallel timeline that's slightly different, where the events of this game never happened, and erases everyone's memory except protagonist Tatsuya's, whose will enables him to possess the body of his alternate timeline self. The gameplay improves of that of the previous game, changing to third-person perspective in dungeons, and having a battle system much more like a standard RPG, but still with 5 party members. This game was never officially released in English, with Atlus never giving an exact reason for skipping the localization, though Hitler's appearance is often considered a likely factor in their decision. Like with Sonic 3 and Knuckles, this game wasn't complete in its original release, and had its story finished in 2000, with the second act, Persona 2 Eternal Punishment, which actually did see a Western release. In the translation of this game, Atlus tried to maintain continuity by reusing the botched translation names for returning characters, but giving new characters more faithful translations. The choice to release this was also strange, because of the plot having many references to the previous entry that was never localised. Maya was the protagonist of this game, with other party members being minor characters from the previous game. Tatsuya and a different returning party member from Persona 1, depending on your choices, were also party members. By the end of the game, Nyarlathotep was seemingly defeated permanently at the price of Tatsuya's consciousness returning to his original apocalyptic universe. In a game very different to any that came before it, Shin Megami Tensei Trading Card Summoner was released for the Game Boy Color in the year 2001. As the name suggests, this game plays like a card battler. The first 2 arcs have a story based on card tournaments, as would be expected, featuring a protagonist named by the player, his sister, who becomes the villain, and his love interest. In an unlockable third act, there's a demonic invasion, and much like standard SMT games, the protagonist can choose to side with lawful angels, chaotic demons, or neither, to get one of 3 endings. Persona has often been compared to Pokemon as spirit Pokemon and the like, but the Devil Children branch of Megami Tensei is definitely the closest the franchise has gotten to Pokemon, and when you look at it, it's very obvious. The first games in this series are Devil Children Black Book and Devil Children Red Book, following the dual games formula of Pokemon. Unlike Pokemon, the 2 versions had plot differences, with different protagonists, the male Setsuna in black and the female Mirai in red, though the overall plot ended up converging, with multiple endings as par for the franchise. However, the ending that ends up restoring the status quo is shown to be canon by the next game. These games were followed by a third version called White Book, released 1 year later with a new protagonist, Masaki. There was also a remake of Black Book and Red Book, packaged together this time on PlayStation in the year 2002. Also in 2002, the next games in the series were released, with the subtitles Light Book and Dark Book. These Game Boy Advance games were released in the West as Demi-Kid's Light version and Dark version. Like the previous game, each version followed a different protagonist. Jin in Light representing law, and Akira in dark representing chaos. Similarly to the original games and the Pokemon franchise, there were demons only available in one game, requiring you to have both to trade to complete your game. The next game in this series took a rather different direction. Devil Children Puzzle Decor was released for the GBA in 2003. This followed Jin and Akira's demon partners rather than Jin and Akira, and as the name suggests, it was an action puzzle game rather than the usual RPG. Jin and Akira's adventures continued in the next Devil Children games, Firebook and Icebook, released in 2003 in Japan only, with Firebook succeeding Lightbook and Icebook succeeding Darkbook. As with all games starring Jin and Akira, these were released for the Game Boy Advance. Continuing on the success of the brand, in 2004, another game was released in the Devil Children line, this time not in the same pattern as before, as it was only one. Messiah Riser follows both Jin and Akira in a sequel to the previous game, but this time with real-time strategy gameplay, rather than the usual RPG gameplay. Before I wrap up the games in this era and move on to the adaptations and spin-offs, we've got to go back to the main Shin Megami Tensei branch for Shin Megami Tensei 9. There's several reasons why this is a notable title. First of which being that it was the only game in the whole franchise to be released for the original Xbox. Secondly, 9 was a pilot game for a Megami Tensei MMORPG, which was why it controlled in real time. An online network pack was intended to be released, but it was scrapped due to low sales, partially due to low sales of the Xbox console itself in Japan. The 9 doesn't come from it being the 9th entry into the Shin Megami Tensei series, as it wasn't. Instead, the 9 comes from the 9 alignments available, like a typical D&D alignment system. Timeline-wise, this game is linked to the original Shin Megami Tensei, set during the time skip between that game's first and second act. The plot is about a virtual version of Tokyo, trying to recreate it before the apocalyptic events of the original game, being invaded by digital demons. I would so love to say we're nearly done for this part, but there have been so many adaptations in other media that we're far from done. I'm going to try and rattle them off as quick as I can though. In the main branch, If received a manga adaptation, following a male protagonist called Nobu, rather than the canon female Tamaki. This ran only for one volume, however a sequel, Shin Megami Tensei Khan, ran for 9. The sequel serves as an alternate sequel to the original game, following the same protagonist as the first manga, and features the usual apocalypse, missing from the original If. Khan also received its own novelization. Giten Megami Tensei received a short story adaptation of its introduction, called Giten Megami Tensei Distant Flow Exile. This was actually published about a year and a half before the game was released, in a volume of Logout, a Japanese magazine, and as such, some details differ from the final game. There were a trio of novels telling parallel stories to major games. Haikyo no Naka no Jin is set during SMT1 and stars a protagonist called Jin. Fukatsu no Jin is set during SMT2, and Makai no Jin is set during If, following an alternate version of Jin. These got a separate manga based on them called Shin Megami Tensei Eden, telling an unrelated story but still featuring Jin. Other manga included Shin Megami Tensei Gaiten Hato no Senki, a 2001 manga, and Shin Megami Tensei CG Senki Dante no Mon, which was a 1999 manga based on the Shin Megami Tensei trading card game. Devil Summoner received several adaptations. Firstly, there's the 1997 live-action TV series, which ran for 2 seasons of 13 episodes. The first season retelling the story of the game, and the second being mostly original. This TV series then got its own light novel versions in 1998, as well as a light novel based directly on the game called Sealed Soul. I discovered these light novels by accident while trying to find out more about the Al Sarain light novels, and I spent a further amount of time trying to work out if these were based on the show or if they were based on the games. While I wouldn't usually count extra compendiums released, since there will be far too many, the 2 Devil Summoner games released in this era each separately released a digital compendium for the Sega Saturn. And additionally, Soul Hackers received a light novel adaptation in 1999 with the subtitle Nightmare of the Butterfly. This was later followed by a separate light novel adaptation called Shito Kourin. In the Persona branch, we had a manga adaptation of Persona 1, which gave the protagonist his more commonly referred to name of Naoya. Additionally, there was a light novel adaptation with a larger focus on party member Maki, under the subtitle Shadow Maze. Persona 2 is the only main series entry to not feature a full manga adaptation, but instead it got a manga spin-off in Tsumi Tobatsu, known to Western fans as Crime and Punishment, featuring a completely separate cast of Persona users, but in the same setting and school as Persona 2 Innocent Sin. Persona 2 had a short OVA adaptation, known as Persona 2 Another Self, which was mainly a trailer for Innocent Sin, while it was released alongside Eternal Punishment. Persona 1 and 2 each received drama CDs, under the subtitles of Duo and The Errors of Their Youth, respectively. Duo was a straight adaptation of the game, whereas Errors was a more light-hearted side-story compilation. On a very technical level, this next piece of media would count as a game, but I'd be incredibly hard-pressed to call it as such. Megami Ibn Roku Persona Digital Collection was a piece of PC software released in 1998, featuring art and wallpapers based on the game, as well as minigames such as a dress-up sim and a personality quiz. Surprisingly, this didn't get localised in the West. Mucken received a manga adaptation, as well as a novel called After Strange Days. I know basically nothing on this novel other than its existence, but I figured I might as well give it a mention. Lastly, for this era we have Shin Megami Tensei Devi Chill, a 50-episode anime based on the first pair of games in the series, and a 52-episode anime series, D Children, Light and Dark, based on the Light Book and Dark Book, which ended with a cliffhanger leading into the Fire/Ice games. These games have also received manga adaptations. The next two videos are all going to be on one time period, as there's two very different aspects of this coming era, so subscribe to stay up to date when that drops. As always, have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.